Hi, welcome. This is Kim Howerton. We're going to talk about the thyroid today. I'm going to try and explain it in ways that make sense to me, and hopefully they will make sense to you. Just a refresher, not a doctor, not a medical provider in any way. Please only use this video as an educational tool and take any specific health concerns to your doctor. Okay? All right. Let's go from there. We'll start the story in our brain, not our thyroid. So we got something in our brain called the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland sends out thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. You might have heard it referred to. And kind of think of it like a bullhorn. So when it's loud, it's saying, we need more. And when it's quiet, it's saying, please make less. So it's sending a message to your thyroid. If you're hypothyroid, you're low in thyroid hormones, and it's saying, please make more. Symptoms of hypothyroidism, extreme fatigue, kind of a blah. It's like being sick without the other symptoms. Like if you ever had the kind of flu or a cold and you feel so tired, but you're not, but none of the cold or flu symptoms except for the tiredness. Then you've got things like you lose your hair, it gets patchy. You can lose like the outer third of your eyebrows, so you're a little spockish. It doesn't go up, but that would be cool if it did. Sometimes even your eyelashes get real thin. You've got dry skin, constipation, weight gain, or inability to drop weight. Those are hypothyroidism symptoms. What are the symptoms of hyperthyroidism? Kind of the opposite. Racing heart is very common. Feeling like you have too much energy in your body. You're kind of hyped up. It might feel like anxiety, where the feeling of hypo is sort of like more like akin to depression. You could call the feeling of hyperthyroidism more anxious, that all revved up feeling. Then there's weight loss. So then with Hashimoto's, one of the things that happens is you kind of fluctuate back and forth at certain stages. So you might feel hypo some of the time and hyper some of the time, and then eventually you just go hypo, but you can go back and forth a bit. Interestingly, sometimes Hashimoto's can be misdiagnosed as bipolar, right? Because you got that switching, that back and forth, a little more towards mania, a little more towards depression. So you can see that often thyroid can impact your mental health in ways that are pretty extreme. TSH, hello, sends a signal to the thyroid. The thyroid makes T4. So T4 because it has 4 iodine atoms attached to it. But we can't use T4 really. We want T3. So 1 iodine atom has to come off, and primarily that happens in the liver, though it happens in other places in the body. Now, so you've heard of T4, now you know about T3. T3 is the type of thyroid hormone we need to use, but thyroid hormone comes both bound, because it's bound to carrier proteins, or unbound, available for use, right? If it's locked up, you can't have it, but if it's open, aka free, you can. So we're looking at free T3 as the type of thyroid hormone we need for utilization. There can also be something called reverse T3, frequently shortened to RT3. Reverse T3 is when that iodine atom comes off, but then it goes to the wrong place. In the case of reverse T3, it's like your next door neighbor is getting all your packages and their door and apartment and everything looks exactly the same. So like Amazon is like, we delivered it. And you're like, I don't have it. So if you don't get it delivered to the right place, you can't use it. We tend to see reverse T3 higher in people specifically when they have, not exclusively, I want to say, but specifically it happens a lot in cases of malnutrition, chronic undereating. Anorexics often have high reverse T3. And you'll also find it in other types of health problems. If you have some other type of chronic health problem, an autoimmune condition, sometimes those people will be more inclined to have high reverse T3. So it's like water everywhere, not a drop to drink, right? Like they're making plenty of T4, or even maybe it's getting converted, but it's not getting converted correctly. So you can see there's a couple of different places where this equation can break down in terms of proper thyroid function. So many of us only think about proper thyroid function as being important for our metabolism. We'll be like, I can't lose weight, I got a sluggish thyroid, right? But it's so much more than that. It's energy. And we can't survive without energy. It's an energy regulating system. So if you have your thyroid removed due to an illness, you're going to need to supplement thyroid hormone or you're not going to survive very long. It helps us regulate things like temperature, like body temperature, right? One of the symptoms of hypothyroidism is actually being cold all the time. You've got mood, blood pressure, the health of your hair, skin, and nails, your muscle health, right? You can end up sarcopenic, like not being able to build muscle, losing muscle when your thyroid is dysregulated. It can also be, I think I said mood, but I'll say it again. Mood is definitely impacted as well as cognitive function. So we need energy, and the system that controls our energy utilization is very important that it be functioning correctly. Sometimes I feel like I'm saying things that you're like, duh, but I said it anyway. Also, one other thing that people don't necessarily think of in terms of thyroid, but they should, I guess it's two other things. Blood sugar management, right? And you think about it, right? It's an energy management system. Blood sugar is energy in your blood. So some people will suffer blood sugar dysregulation with thyroid problems, and then bone mineral density. Energy is essential for growth, muscle growth, hair growth, and bone growth. So if you are suffering from thyroid problems long term, you might find you have osteoporosis, you have blood sugar dysregulation, you feel like general crap, and then your muscle mass isn't that great. I mean, it's just altogether a bleep show. I'll just say, really bad. Another thing that a lot of people don't know about, but they should, if you have chronic cholesterol issues, what's the word? Cholesterol issues. Lipids are a type of energy. Thyroid is an energy management system. Indeed, your thyroid being dysregulated can cause your lipids to go wonky. And so you might be like, your doctor might be on your case to treat you for your high LDL, but not trying to treat your screwy thyroid. And it's like, what the heck? What are the tests? You got a TSH, you got a free T4 or a T4 free, however you want to say that. You got a free T3 and you've got a reverse T3. So those are the four main thyroid tests. You'll also want to get tested for Hashimoto's. Now, if you're negative for antibodies, the first time you get this test and you don't suspect that you have it after that, you wouldn't have to keep testing it. But if you suspect that you do have it and you're now monitoring the levels, then you will continue to test this one. Try to enunciate thyroid peroxidase antibodies. That can also be called a TPO sometimes. And then the thyroglobulin antibodies, a TG. So those are the two Hashimoto's tests, and you're testing for antibody level in there. And so it'll say like under 4, and that generally means, or under 9, whatever the cutoff is at that test. That generally means if you're under that level, it's not detectable. If you're over that level, then you want to keep testing it to make sure that you stay, like you're going down, not up. So those are the specific thyroid tests that I and Dr. Ken Berry recommend in our labs book, which is upcoming in the next few months. So I just listed the specific blood tests you want to get to test your thyroid function. But what do they mean, right? So if you run these tests, your doctor orders these tests, you're going to get a copy of your results. You should. If you don't get a copy of your results, make your doctor give you a copy of your results, by the way, people, okay? Tip. There will be something on those results called a reference interval or a reference range. Means the same thing, just in different words. And essentially what we think of that reference interval as is like, are we good or are we off? Are we in? Are we out? Right? And one thing I want to tell you a little bit more is this thing called the reference range. I'll put it up here so that you can see it a little better. So when they come up with these numbers to say like what's in range and what do we think is out of range, for most tests, there are a few exceptions, but for most tests, what they do is they get a sample of the population. So you've got the population as a whole, and then they take everybody's numbers and they lay it out on, what's the curve look like? And they exclude the ends, right? They're like, you're too far, too low, you're too high. We're going to take the 95 in the middle. Now, supposedly, the people they're getting that reference range from is a, quote, healthy population, right? They try to exclude people who have known disorders in the arena they're testing. Which makes sense, right? They want the, quote unquote, I keep saying quote unquote, that's annoying, isn't it? They want the normal, supposedly normal range, right? The problem is, as we might know in today's society, 88% of the population is metabolically unhealthy. We know this. There'll be a link to that paper in the notes. And so what population are they actually able to study? Because another problem is really healthy people are not getting a lot of blood tests usually. Well, unless you're a biohacker, but that's a really small population, right? So you have to assume there's some leakage, that some of the population that's being tested as a healthy population is not what many of us would call a healthy population. So you've got to factor that thought in when you're looking at this reference or interval range. And so another thing I have to bring up specifically with regards to thyroid health, we've only been testing these thyroid numbers for a small period of our history. And that period is post-agriculture, when our diets moved from what we might call more ancestral, which is, more hunting gathering, to a more agrarian or grain-based diet. So what we think of as normal reference range or normal numbers is based on eating a certain way. And this is true in many categories. What we might call a normal blood sugar, what we might call a normal insulin level, down the list, there are several blood markers when you get lab tests where you have to say, these are normal numbers for a certain population. Am I in that population? And might my numbers look different and still be healthy? So that is something to consider specifically with the thyroid. The other thing that you should think about with thyroid numbers, and many numbers, not just thyroid, is there is what is the normal range, the reference range, the range that LabCorp or Quest will tell you is the range to be in and not out of. But a lot of functional med practitioners, people who really work with populations trying to get healthy, not just treat sickness, they have a different range. It's not like totally different usually, but it's usually a smaller range or skewed towards one end of the spectrum, or it's slightly different because they've looked at their patient population and said, what do I actually really see aligning with health here? So those are a few things you should think about when you're comparing blood tests. So if you go and get these thyroid tests and maybe your TSH is like 4 and your doctor's like, you're fine. You're like, I'm not. I would suggest that might not be what we would call optimal. So you have to look at beyond trying to have sort of average health and instead say, how can I optimize this? How can I be in a better range, right? So those are just some things to think about. Why did I lay that groundwork? Well, here's a specific thing you should know. On a very low carb diet, often we find T3 numbers lower than the other numbers in terms of the range. So they've done tests on this in low carb populations, and they've done good tests. It's like, they tested them when they weren't low carb, they tested them when they were. And they found that when on low carb, often T3 drops, whereas the other markers don't. But we tend to talk about it like dropped, which is like, oh, it changed. It's different. It was normal and now it's unnormal. But I want you to think back about what I talked about, which is once upon a time, we were not a society that ate a ton of grains and carbs, right? And those people would match the current people who are on low carb diets in terms of a lower T3 number. So the question I would pose to you is the reference or interval range of T3 that the general population presents us with, is that optimal? Is that normal? One of the things you could say is, oh, low carb drops your T3. You could also say high carb requires a higher T3. And so the body accommodates that by raising your T3, right? So just conceptually, these are just two different ways of looking at it. So you could see the lower T3 on a low carb diet as a problem, something that has arisen, or you could look at it as potentially a state that many of our ancestors were in, but in modern agricultural times, that extra amount of carbohydrate we started eating required more T3. And so one of the things I want to really bring home here is for you to truly be hypo or hyperthyroid, you have to look at the symptoms. You can't just look at the labs. If you are asymptomatic, but one of your lab numbers is different than you thought it would be, you really have to question if you truly are hypothyroid or if you are in fact just in a different range because of a different eating pattern. I bring this topic up, obviously, because this is talked about as a negative of keto or low carb often, that this T3 number is found to be lower. But I will link in the notes a really great paper that talks about that it's really how we look at this. Is it really that it lowers your T3, or is it that carbs raise it? And so because that reference population are high carb eaters, that we might not fall into the reference range. I'm a big advocate for feeling good and not feeling bad. That's a really easy thing to be an advocate for, by the way. But I want your thyroid to be healthy and happy. I'm not saying ignore symptoms because you're low carb and you're fine. And I'm not saying you can't have symptoms on low carb. But I'm saying if you don't have symptoms, and in these studies that they looked at, they over and over again saw people on low carb diets had lower T3, felt fine, had no hypothyroid symptoms, gave them more carbs, still felt fine, still no symptoms of hypo or hyperthyroid, but that T3 number just kept changing. And so if you want to read the studies, they'll be in there. And I'll try and talk about it a little more in the specific study episode, which will be kind of a snoozer for some of you that aren't geeky. So I'm going to put the real detail of that in another video. But I thought it was important to talk about this specific issue because it gets brought up so much. So there are some nutrients that are essential for proper thyroid function. What? You thought we could just make some thyroid hormone out of nothing? No, you need some nutrients for that. So you need specifically iodine, you need L-tyrosine, and you need selenium. Those things work together to create thyroid hormone. So iodine, you might have heard me mention earlier, right? T4 having 4 iodine atoms, T3 having 3. So obviously very imperative in this process. So things that are high in iodine, we got things like fish or seafood in general. Seaweed, very high in iodine. There are also some other foods that have a fair amount of iodine, like cranberries, and a few other plant sources. So you can get iodine from a variety of sources, but it's kind of hard to calculate if you're getting the sufficient amount of iodine. Just as an aside, this is why iodized salt started happening. It was in the 1920s that the US government decided to put iodine in all salt that was sold, like the Umbrella Girl salt, right? As salt was being sold, they added iodine to it because there was at the time actually a big problem with iodine deficiency. People had goiters. Have you ever heard of a goiter? It's like a swollen neck or a swollen spot on a neck. Essentially, you can think about a goiter being created because the signal is going to the thyroid to say, make thyroid hormone, more. Hello, is anyone listening? Right? And the thyroid was like trying, like chugga, little engine that could, but because it didn't have the iodine to make the thyroid hormone from, the thyroid would just grow. It was like, well, we'll just get bigger. So that's one reason for a goiter. There can be others, but a big reason that they were happening at that time was iodine deficiency. So they're like, well, everyone uses salt. We'll put iodine in the salt. And that's how iodized salt became a thing. I think the Swiss were doing it before we were, but now pretty much most nations do it. But Anyway, so if you're not eating commercial salt, and there are some really good reasons you might not want the microplastics and things in your salt, and you're getting a really good quality sea salt or Himalayan salt, Redmond's real salt, one of those kinds of salts. While they have some naturally occurring iodine because they come from the sea, and the sea has iodine with the fishies that swim in it, and the kelp and all that good stuff, but it might not be enough. So that's why they find actually people that eat sort of clean might actually get less iodine than people that don't. So you might want to think about that. Not to suggest to stop eating clean, but you might want to add some iodine to your diet. Make sure you're getting some fish if you don't like fish, or make sure you're getting some seaweed. If you don't like seaweed, then maybe make sure that you're getting maybe a supplement that includes iodine. Now, I'm not suggesting, there are some people out there who are like, lots of iodine. You want all the iodine that was ever created. I'm not suggesting hyper supplementing your iodine. That is a whole nother kettle of fish. But I'm saying you need enough. So you need to meet your requirement for iodine. So I use a little bit of Lugol's iodine drops in my coffee now and again, just to make sure I'm topping off, because I really don't like fish. I know. I should. It's good for you. I don't like it. Okay. So better to deal with reality. And if you don't like it, then you need to supplement it for the most part. By the way, did you know that it's not just about your thyroid, but all our cells have a sodium iodine transporter on them? So yeah, that iodine, super important. Also, proper iodine levels have been shown to reduce inflammation and CRP, which is a marker of inflammation. So I'm just going to put the shout out there for iodine. Anyway, let's talk about the other things I mentioned. L-tyrosine, which is an amino acid that is made from another amino acid, phenylalanine. So L-tyrosine is made in our body. It's converted from phenylalanine. And then it's combined with selenium to allow us to create the T4. I have some good news about the L-tyrosine and the selenium. If you eat just like a moderately appropriate amount of meat in your diet to get the amount of protein you need in your diet, then you're probably meeting your selenium and your L-tyrosine needs. The people that really have to worry about selenium and L-tyrosine are people like vegetarians or vegans. The plant source that is actually highest in selenium, you may have heard of, it's in Brazil nuts, and in crazy high quantities. Brazil nuts are actually like one of the only foods you could overdose on selenium, because in high enough doses, selenium is in fact toxic. Some of you who watch House, the show, who are old like me, might remember there was an episode about that. But it would be challenging because Brazil nuts are pretty filling and you'd have to eat quite a bit, but it would be pretty much impossible to overdose on selenium from meat or any of the other thing. And it is possible with Brazil nuts. So have some, don't have them all. But do you actually need to add Brazil nuts to your diet if you're regularly eating a sufficient quantity of meat? Probably not. If you like them, have one, but probably not. So I hope this was a helpful sort of overview of like, what are we testing when we're looking at thyroid numbers? You learned a little bit more about like reference ranges. You learned that you can have some numbers out of reference range and be asymptomatic, and maybe that's not a problem. You might also be symptomatic, which would indicate a problem. And so it will go on in the series to talk about, what do you do then? What if you actually are symptomatic? What does that mean? How do you deal with that? So I want to get into that in future episodes, but today, hopefully you got a baseline about how your thyroid should function, what are the mechanisms, where are the glands, what's happening, and then we'll go from there. So we're laying the foundation, and we're stacking knowledge on top.